What you just saw were the very first seconds of the movie Gravity, and I personally haven't seen a better use of negative space in any other movie ever. Before I get into today's topic though, I want to mention that next to being a hobby philosopher, I'm first and foremost a visual artist. A fine and tattoo artist to be precise, with many other hobbies on the side. For me, my work and philosophy are both equally important. My work because, well, it's my work. And luckily, I mostly love what I do. And philosophy because it's something that no living being should live without, in my opinion. It has great impact on our happiness, our relationships, and in the end on our work as well. Philosophy shouldn't be stripped off at the doorstep to your office, but instead it should infuse your work and help you to make meaningful and healthy choices in your professional life that then will reflect back again on your personal life. One really feeds the other, and that in both directions in a circular motion. Now, today's video is a bit more about work, but it's interesting that more often than not, we can use what we learn in philosophy, or science or religion for that matter, even with things that might not seem to have a connection to it at first glance. Let me tell you otherwise today. Last time I talked about balance, and it was focused mainly on pain, pleasure, and dopamine, with emphasis on their impact on our private life. Balance means to alternate stressful times with rest, to invite calmness and stillness into our daily routines, to be able to deal with unavoidable storms, and to exercise restraint in order to better appreciate the exciting things in our life. In other words, to be truly impressed by a thunderstorm, the sky has to be peaceful most of the time. Sunshine is so amazing because half of the day is covered in darkness. Achievements taste so sweet because of the myriads of failures leading up to it. The punchline of a joke hits usually harder after a theatrical pause. And the unrefined German food your mother cooked for you as a kid suddenly grows immensely in emotional value once you move to Canada and haven't had it for 8 years. Now, believe it or not, but we can apply the same philosophy of balance to visual arts and actually all sorts of other arts. Let's take music, for example. In order to appreciate the intensity of Vivaldi's Presto from Summer, it really needs that adagio right before. Another example is cinema, which brings me back to Gravity. If you drown a movie in action scenes, it will create a very saturated and at the same time bland atmosphere where nothing sticks out anymore. If everyone screams in a movie, then you as a viewer will totally blend out all those screams, because you attribute the same importance to each and every one of them, which in the end will be no importance at all. But if just one person screams in a sea of silence, that's when you listen. You get the point. The movie Gravity actually reversed that effect in that opening sequence. They made the silence palpable with an intense noise right before they cut it off in a pinch, which is just beautiful. It's all about suspense and contrast and paving the way for the main act or the main actor. And the same is true for paintings and illustrations and even tattoo designs. To make the main subject of an artwork shine, it needs to be able to breathe. And that breathing room is what visual artists call negative space. And that is finally what I want to talk about today. I think negative space is my most favorite part of any visual design. Even though negative space implies an absence of something, it doesn't mean that it has no value. On the contrary, as we just established, negative space is the necessary silence that gives the sound its intensity. It's the shadow that makes the light shine brighter. Without negativity, there is no positivity. Negative space is everything in your artwork that is not the main actor. It's the filling, the background tapestry, the foliage, the Caesar salad on the side. And just as in actual space, where dark matter is not nothing, but instead an invisible something, it takes up physical space to give the objects in it the necessary room to dance. Without that space, every object in the universe would be huddled together into one big mass of nonsense. Without space, your toes would constantly be cold from playing footsie with a Neptune, while your head would have a never-ending fever from banging against the sun. Without space, we wouldn't have any air to breathe, for that matter. Spaceless space doesn't sound like fun in the slightest. Without negative space, we wouldn't be able to amuse each other with optical illusions like the Rubens vase that challenge our figure ground perception. We wouldn't be able to navigate websites easily because we couldn't distinguish the menu bar from the blog entry. And we also wouldn't be able to read a book because the white space between letters is negative space too. In fact, the two terms are often used interchangeably. But white space actually refers to literally white areas between illustrations, and more importantly, importantly between letters and bodies of text and a page layout. So all white spaces are negative spaces, but not all negative spaces are white spaces. Though people argue a bit about the terminology, so be flexible when you do some complementary research. For me as a fine and tattoo artist, the most important aspect of negative space, however, is that it frames, defines and supports the main subject of an artwork. As a very active component of any design, it separates all the important focal points and ideally leads the eye of the viewer through a picture while providing places to rest. The use of negative space is not always that obvious though. Let's have a look at the Mona Lisa, for example. The most important focal points in this famous portrait are, of course, the face and also the hands. Notice how both of these parts are surrounded by darkness to draw the focus immediately to the things that build the striking character of his subject. He knew how to make things clear, and that already in the 15th century. Now, negative space doesn't just create a vital contrast and separates and defines the limits of objects though. It also creates the necessary bonds between them according to Gestalt principles. These principles are most commonly proximity, similarity, closure, continuity, figure ground, symmetry, common fate, and prägnanz. There are some fancy German words in here that I will leave you hanging with, because I can. Some people add a few principles or omit some. It's a constant development kind of thing. I might go into more detail about Gestalt theory in another video, but this one is already getting way too long for modern attention spans. Negative space plays a role of varying importance in all of these principles, but it is the most vital for our perception of figure ground and closure. Let's have a look at some more defined examples for those. As already hinted at with the Rubens vase, negative space cannot just provide a passive area of balance, but instead it can also play an active role in a design. The FedEx logo is an often used example for negative space being a subject in its own right, where the empty space between E and X forms an arrow to symbolize speediness and destination-oriented efficiency. There are lots of other great examples for this interplay of figure and ground, and they are always a genius way of getting a maximum amount of message across in just one image. Good examples of the principle of closure can also often be found in logos, like this one from the World Wildlife Fund, where our brain just completes the broken shapes to create a picture that we recognize. Another hidden closure gem is the 8 of Diamonds. I bet you never noticed that one before. I didn't either. I just found this while googling for examples, and now I'm as flabbergasted as you. And lastly, let's not forget about Coles Phillips, a late 19th century illustrator for magazines and advertisements. His so-called fade-away girls are a wonderful example of the effect of closure. Apart from that, negative space can also describe a light source. Leaving a shape blank and lightening up its immediate surrounding can make it appear glowing and shining. And if all that isn't already enough to convince you to give negative space some special attention, it gets even more interesting when you put its usage to an extreme. When negative space is taking up a huge portion of an artwork, it usually does one of two things. It either conveys a sense of tranquility and contemplation, or a feeling of isolation, depending on its application and the general tone of the artwork as a whole. The vast empty skies and large barren walls in Edward Hopper's paintings, for example, often evoke feelings of loneliness and introspection, amplifying the solitude of his characters. I actually had to copy this painting during my apprenticeship in the German opera in Berlin. I have a love-hate relationship with Hopper since then. Now, before I wrap up this video, I would like to point out that a lot of artists that I personally admire have a strong use of negative space in common. Coincidentally, but also not so coincidentally, I guess. Because for me, it makes an artwork a million times more interesting. One of those artists is Nick Allen, a contemporary oil painter with lots of actual room in his work. Jeremy Geddes is also someone whose paintings always fascinated me for his very active usage of negative space, especially in his astronaut paintings. I would also like to mention Randy Ortiz, whom I admire mostly for his older black and white illustrations that are so striking because of those vast and purely black areas in them. And lastly, I would count Rembrandt in as well, as I'm generally a big fan of the Baroque painting style, which is easily recognized through his usage of big shadow shapes that are also nothing more than negative space. I'm generally a huge proponent of less is more. After all, too much of a good thing can actually make it a bad thing, like vitamin E. It's vital to have a proper amount of it, but too much of it can lead to fatal bleeding, which I haven't experienced yet, but I bet it's uncomfortable. Thus, everything good should come in moderation. And just as ice cream, Netflix, and house parties, positive space in a work of art is no exception. Don't let absence and emptiness scare you, and try it out today by introducing some silence into your day, or by leaving some dates in your calendar completely unoccupied, or by erasing 10% of your new book manuscript like Stephen King recommends, or Marie Kondo your apartment a bit next spring. Or don't and embrace the clutter. That is a valid option. I would personally refrain from that option, mainly for reasons of aesthetics, but no one will report you to the Gestalt police for not adhering to its principles. Thus, in the end, it doesn't really matter what you do with all of this information. But whatever you do, stay curious while doing it. Thanks for watching. White little place of overall tranquility. Oh man, this is a mean word for me. Jesus Christ.